My daughter-in-law Priya smiled at our Christmas table and said, "My pecan pie smelled aggressively southern." Then watched her husband laugh along with her while my grandchildren sat confused. And that was the moment 3 years of swallowed silence finally cracked something open inside me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Carol Whitfield. I'm 63 years old, and I live alone now in the same pale blue house in Greenville, South Carolina, where I raised my son Marcus and his younger sister Diane. The house is small by most standards. The kitchen has the same white tile backsplash my late husband Gerald put in himself the summer of 1998, chipped on one corner, where Diane dropped a ceramic mixing bowl, trying to help me bake. I've never replaced that tile. Some imperfections feel more like history than damage. Gerald Whitfield passed 6 years ago. Heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning in March. He was making coffee. He didn't suffer, the doctor said, which I suppose was meant to comfort me. What nobody tells you is that 6 years later, you still set 2 mugs out sometimes before you remember. Gerald loved Christmas more than any grown man had a right to. He'd hang lights on the dogwood tree in the front yard, starting the first weekend of December, every single year, even the year his back gave him trouble, and Marcus had to hold the ladder. He'd sing off-key carols in the kitchen while I baked. He'd eat 3 slices of pecan pie and claim each one was to make sure the previous slice hadn't been a dream. That tradition of baking at Christmas, the pecan pie, the pound cake, the coconut layer cake that took 2 full days to make properly, that started with my mother Evelyn Harris, who learned it from her mother before that. Every December, our kitchen smelled like brown sugar and toasted pecans, and something warm and ancient that I couldn't name, but always recognized. It felt like belonging. It felt like proof that the people we loved had stood in this same spot and made something good with their hands. After Gerald died, baking became the one thing that made December bearable. Marcus always came home for Christmas. Diane drove up from Savannah with her husband and the kids, and for a few days, the house felt like itself again, instead of just the place where I went to sleep alone. Then Marcus met Priya Anand at a conference in Atlanta. That was 4 years ago. I liked her immediately, if I'm honest. She was sharp and funny and looked at my sons like he was something worth seeing. Marcus Whitfield had always been the quiet type, steady and careful with his words, and Priya brought a brightness into his orbit that I hadn't seen in years. They got married in a small ceremony 18 months later. I helped pick the flowers. The first Christmas she came to Greenville, I baked everything. Pecan pie, pound cake, the coconut layer cake, plus a batch of pralines Gerald always requested. Priya was polite about all of it, gracious even. She took small tastes of each dish and said they were lovely. I felt proud showing her the recipes, explaining which ones came from my mother, which ones I'd learned on my own. She listened and nodded and asked questions. I went to bed that Christmas Eve feeling like something good was beginning. I should have paid closer attention to the second year. She arrived that December with a carry-on full of supplements and what she described as clean eating commitments. She'd started a new wellness program, she explained, setting her bag down in the guest room while Marcus carried in the luggage. She talked about refined sugar and saturated fat with the casual authority of someone who had recently discovered these concepts and assumed no one else had. I stood in the kitchen doorway listening and told myself it was just a phase. At dinner that first evening, she picked at the food and talked about what she'd been eating in New York, where they'd moved for Marcus's job the previous spring. Cold-pressed juices, grain bowls, a Thai restaurant downtown with actually healthy options. She said actually healthy, the way some people say their doctor's name, like it was a credential that ended further conversation. Marcus kept his eyes on his plate. He said the pound cake was good, and I believed him because Marcus didn't compliment food he didn't mean. But Priya set her fork down after one small bite and said she was still full from the drive. Then she took out her phone. I cleaned the kitchen alone that night. The third Christmas, she came with a friend. Not a close friend, a colleague from work named Beatrix, who was spending the holiday in the area and needed somewhere to go. I said of course. I always said of course. I made extra batter for the pound cake and set another place at the table. That was the Christmas everything changed. The day before Christmas Eve, I spent 9 hours baking. My feet ached, My lower back tightened around hour 6, the way it does now that I'm past 60. And I sat on the step stool for 15 minutes before starting the coconut cake. I thought about my mother while I worked, the way she'd stand at the stove, humming hymns low under her breath, her hands moving through flour like the motion itself was prayer. I thought about Gerald asking me every December if this was going to be the year I finally opened a bakery. Maybe someday, I always told him. He always laughed. He knew I didn't mean it. The baking was never meant for strangers. It was meant for us. I carried the finished cakes to the counter around 8 that evening. They looked exactly right. Diane called from Savannah to say they'd be arriving by noon the next day. And her youngest had already started talking about Grandma's pecan pie at school. That made me stand a little straighter. Marcus and Priya arrived the following morning. Beatrix came with them, carrying a tote bag from a boutique grocery store in Charleston and a bottle of wine with a French name I couldn't pronounce. She was pleasant enough, tall, thin, the kind of effortless thinness that reads less like genetics and more like discipline. And she moved through my house with the comfortable curiosity of someone who found modest spaces charming in the way vacation rentals are charming. Not home. Charming. We sat down for Christmas dinner at 5 o'clock. The table was full. Diane's kids were arguing over who got to sit nearest to the window. Her husband, Kevin, was helping Marcus set out the extra chairs. The house smelled exactly the way December was supposed to smell. I brought out the pecan pie first, set it in the center of the table, still warm. Gerald's favorite. Diane's youngest immediately reached for it, and Kevin caught his hand with a quiet, "Not yet, buddy," and everyone laughed. Then Priya's colleague, Beatrix, leaned toward the pie with an expression of theatrical appraisal and said, "Oh wow, homemade?" "From scratch," I said. "You can tell," Beatrix said, in a tone that wasn't quite complimentary. "It's so rich-looking." Priya laughed softly. "Carol makes everything the old-fashioned way." "It's very," she paused, tilting her head. "Southern." "Aggressively Southern," Beatrix said, and they both laughed. Marcus looked at his plate. He didn't say anything. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. Not the comment, but the silence. My son, who had eaten this pie every Christmas of his life, who had stood in this kitchen as a boy licking the spoon and asking when it would be ready. He looked at his plate and said nothing. Diane's face had gone very still. Her youngest asked loudly, "What does aggressively mean?" And I smiled and said, "It means very, very good," and cut the first slice and pretended nothing had happened. Because that is what I had been doing for 2 years by then. That is what I had trained myself to do. Absorb, redirect, pretend. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, and Kevin and Diane had gone to bed, and Marcus and Priya were in the guest room with the door closed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the leftover pie, and a cup of coffee I didn't really want. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she used to say that a woman who cooks for her family is speaking a language that never needs translation. I thought about Gerald singing carols off-key. I thought about how I had spent 9 hours on my feet the day before so my grandchildren could have the same Christmas I had. The same one my mother gave me. The same one her mother gave her. And I thought, this is the 3rd year. And every year it gets a little worse. I didn't sleep much that night. The following morning, Christmas morning, I came downstairs early as always. I was measuring coffee grounds when Priya appeared in the kitchen doorway in her running clothes, earbuds in, water bottle in hand. "You're up early," she said. "I always am." She opened the refrigerator and looked at the leftover cakes and closed it again. Then she opened it a second time and took out a container of the cold-pressed green juice she'd brought from the city. "You know," she said, pouring it into a glass, "I've been thinking. Marcus and I are probably going to do a detox in January. Try to reset after the holidays." She glanced at the cakes. "This time of year is really tough for people trying to stay healthy." I kept my hands wrapped around my coffee mug. "Some people, sure," I said. "It's not a judgment," she said quickly, smiling. "It's just, this is the kind of food that's really designed for a different era, right? Before people understood nutrition the way we do now. Before people understood." As if my mother had been baking in ignorance. As if love needed a nutritional label to be valid. I didn't answer. She went for her run. I stood at the counter alone, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't smooth it over in my own mind. I just let it sit there, uncomfortable and true. Diane found me like that 20 minutes later when she came down for coffee. She looked at my face and immediately said, "What happened?" "Nothing. Carol Ann Whitfield, you are the worst liar I have ever known." I almost laughed. She knew me too well. I told her what Priya had said. Diane poured her coffee slowly, listening, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This isn't new, is it?" "No. She does this every year. Every year it gets a little sharper." Diane sat down across from me. "Why do you let her?" I opened my mouth to say what I always said. "She doesn't mean it. She's from a different background. She's just passionate about health." And then I stopped. Because I had said all of those things before, for 3 years, and none of them had made it feel any better. "I don't know anymore," I said instead. That was the truth. Diane shook her head slowly. "Mom, you spent 9 hours on your feet for this family." She spent 2 minutes undermining it in front of a stranger she brought to your house. I stared at my coffee. "Where does it end?" Diane asked. I didn't have an answer. But the question stayed with me the rest of the day, through Christmas morning, and the gift opening. And the dinner that felt different now, quieter, more careful. Like everyone was eating around something none of us wanted to name. That evening, Marcus found me alone in the kitchen wrapping the leftover pound cake. He leaned in the doorway, and for a moment he looked so much like his father that my chest hurt. "Mom," he said, "I'm fine. You're not fine." I kept wrapping the cake. "Marcus, it's Christmas." He came in and sat at the table. "I know she can be a lot sometimes." "Sometimes," he exhaled. "She cares about health stuff. It's not personal." I set the plastic wrap down and looked at my son. This careful, quiet man, who had never in his life deliberately hurt anyone, who had learned his father's particular brand of gentleness and made it his own. And I said, as gently as I could manage, "It feels personal, Marcus. When someone calls the food I made for your father's memory aggressively Southern at my own Christmas table. It feels personal." He was quiet for a long time. I should have said something. "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." He didn't argue with that, which was something. But nothing changed. And the next Christmas, I started to understand that nothing would change unless I changed it. I didn't decide immediately. It happened slowly, the way most honest reckonings do. Over the following year, I thought about those 3 Christmases more than I wanted to. I thought about the particular way Priya's voice went when she talked about my baking. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive. The way you dismiss something that doesn't require your respect. I thought about Beatrix's laugh. I thought about Marcus's silence. I thought about my mother. In October, I ran into my old friend Willa Chambers at the pharmacy. Willa and I had taught at the same elementary school for 12 years before she retired, and she had a way of cutting directly to the center of any situation that I had always found equal parts comforting and terrifying. We stood in the vitamin aisle talking for 40 minutes. She asked about the holidays, and I told her. Not everything, but enough. She listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual for Willa. When I finished, she said, "So, you're going to let her do it again this year?" "I don't know what else to do." Willa looked at me steadily. "Yes, you do. You just don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable, and you're afraid of what Marcus will say. He's my son. He's also a grown man who stood in your kitchen watching someone disrespect you and said nothing. Those 2 things can both be true." I bought my vitamins and went home. That night I sat at the kitchen table. The same table, always the same table. The one Gerald and I bought at an estate sale in 1994 and refinished ourselves. And I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not angry. Just clear. I was not going to perform contentment I didn't feel. Not this year. I called Marcus the first week of November. We talked about the usual things, his work, the apartment they were renovating, whether Kevin and Diane's youngest had made the soccer team. Then I said, carefully, "I want to talk to you about Christmas." "Of course, Mom, we'll be there." "I know. I want to talk about how the last few years have felt." Silence. "I don't want to make it a big thing," I said. "But I need you to hear me. Your wife's comments about my cooking have made me feel small in my own home. 3 years in a row. And last year she said it in front of a guest she brought to my table." More silence. "Mom, she doesn't mean." "Marcus." My voice was quieter than I expected. "I know you love her. I know she doesn't intend harm the way some people intend harm. But the effect is the same. I have spent 3 Decembers bracing myself at my own stove. That's not the Christmas your father built for this family. I heard him breathing. Slow, careful. I'm not asking for a confrontation, I said. I'm asking for respect at my own table, that's all. He said he understood. He said he would talk to Priya. He sounded like he meant it. What happened next told me everything I needed to know. Priya called me 2 days later. Calm, measured, the voice of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say. She said she was sorry if her comments had landed wrong. She said she'd only been trying to open a conversation about health choices, that she thought of it as caring, not criticizing. She said she hoped I understood the distinction. I thanked her. I said I appreciated the call, and after I hung up, I sat very still for a while. If her comments had landed wrong, I was wrong to say them. If they had landed wrong, as though the problem lived in my reception rather than her delivery. I understood then that this was what I was dealing with. Not malice, but something almost harder to navigate. Absolute certainty of one's own reasonableness. I called Diane that evening. She apologized for how you heard it, Diane said. That's exactly right. Diane was quiet, then. What are you going to do? I looked at the calendar on my refrigerator, December circled in red, the way I circled it every year. Christmas planned months in advance, groceries ordered, recipes pulled from the box, my mother's aunt handwriting on index cards spread across the counter. I'm going to have Christmas, I said. But I'm going to have it for the people who want to be there. Diane understood what I meant. I wasn't sure Marcus would. I didn't uninvite Priya outright. What I did was simpler and in some ways harder. I called Marcus the week before Christmas and told him that I was scaling back this year, keeping things quieter. Just immediate family. Diane, Kevin, the kids, Marcus. I wasn't hosting additional guests. Beatrix wasn't planning to come this year anyway, he said, confused. I know. I just wanted to be clear about what this Christmas looks like. A pause. Are you saying Priya isn't welcome? I'm saying this year I'm protecting my peace, Marcus. If Priya can come to my table and treat my cooking, and me, with basic respect, then she is always welcome. But I'm not able to keep offering my best and receiving contempt in return. You're my son and I love you. I need you to hear that clearly. The silence afterward was longer than any we'd had before. He came without her. I didn't ask why. He didn't explain. He arrived Christmas Eve alone, carrying a bottle of wine and a look on his face I recognized from when he was 12 years old, and had done something he wasn't sure how to account for. Careful, watchful, a little lost. Diane and Kevin arrived an hour later, and the house immediately became loud with the children, who ran straight to the kitchen to see what I'd made. I had baked everything. All of it. Pecan pie, pound cake, coconut layer cake, pralines, the cranberry bread that Gerald always called unnecessary but ate 4 slices of every year. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway watching me work, the same way Gerald used to stand there on Sunday mornings. You didn't have to do all this, he said. Yes, I did. Mom, sit down, Marcus. There's coffee, he sat. We didn't talk about Priya that evening. We talked about other things. Gerald's old stories. The time the dogwood tree lights shorted out 3 years running. The Christmas Diane's youngest tried to leave cookies for Santa and put out cat food by accident because he'd confused the boxes. Marcus laughed at that one. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard from him in a while. Christmas Day felt like something returning. The kids came downstairs at 6:15 in the morning, which is the law when you're under 10 years old and it's Christmas. Marcus was already up. I found him in the kitchen, making coffee in the old machine, and something about seeing him there, doing that small familiar thing, made my throat tighten, in a way I didn't entirely expect. We ate breakfast together. All of us, crowded around the table, the children still in pajamas. Kevin told a bad joke, and Diane pretended not to laugh, and laughed anyway. Marcus helped his nephew pour syrup without making a disaster of it, and looked quietly pleased with himself. After the gifts, after the noise and the wrapping paper and the children's absolute certainty that this was the best Christmas ever in all of recorded history, I went to the kitchen to start the pie. Marcus followed me. He stood at the counter watching me measure the pecans, the same way he used to watch as a boy when he was hoping for batter to scrape. After a while he said, I talked to her, I know, he stopped, started again. She's working on it, Mom. I think she doesn't realize how things come across sometimes. I kept my eyes on the bowl. I hope that's true. I should have said something sooner. Yes, he didn't apologize for that directly. I didn't ask him to. Some things just need to be said aloud and then let sit. Is she welcome next year? He asked. I looked at my son. He was 40 now. He had Gerald's jawline and my mother's eyes, and a heart so careful with the people it loved that it sometimes forgot to protect itself. I thought about the conversation I wanted to have with him and realized this wasn't the moment for all of it. Some things you work toward in pieces. Next year, I said. We'll see. Come back and hand me that vanilla. He handed me the vanilla. He stayed in the kitchen while the pie filled the house with the smell of butter and toasted sugar, and everything I had learned to love from the women who taught me. At some point, Diane appeared in the doorway with her coffee and took one look at the two of us, and quietly came in and sat down at the table without saying a word. Like she was settling in for something she'd been waiting to return to. That was Christmas. I heard from Priya in January, a text first, then a longer message. She said Marcus had talked to her. Really talked to her, she said, and she understood now that her comments had been hurtful in ways she hadn't intended. She used the word hurtful, not her language about things landing wrong. That was different enough to notice. She said she'd like to come to Greenville sometime in the spring, not for a holiday, just to visit, to try again. She said she knew it wasn't something that could be fixed quickly, and she wasn't expecting that. I read the message twice. Then I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen and stood for a moment looking at the tile, backsplash, Gerald put in. The chipped corner where the bowl broke all those years ago. I thought about my mother's hands working through flour. I thought about Gerald's voice asking what's cooking from the other room. I thought about what Willa Chambers had said. You know what to do, you just don't want to do it. I picked the phone back up and typed. I would like that. Not immediately, not with everything resolved. But honestly, healing isn't something that arrives whole. It comes in pieces, in small moments of choosing something different than you chose before. Priya and I are not what I would call close, not yet. Maybe not ever in the way I'd once hoped. But she came to Greenville in April and sat at my kitchen table and watched me make biscuits, without saying a word about refined carbohydrates. And that was something. Marcus sat with us and told old stories about growing up in this house, stories I hadn't heard him tell in years, and at one point Priya laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. At the story about the Christmas lights and the dogwood tree. She asked me later if I'd write down the pecan pie recipe. I said yes. I'm 63 years old, and I live in a pale blue house in Greenville, South Carolina, and every December my kitchen smells like brown sugar and toasted pecans and something warm and old that I couldn't name but always recognize. My mother's hands taught me. Gerald's voice sang beside me. My children carry it forward now, even when the carrying is difficult, even when it takes longer than you hoped. That is what this kind of love looks like. Not dramatic, not perfect, just persistent. And I'll tell you something else I know now. Something I should have understood sooner. The table you set deserves people who are grateful to sit at it, not just grateful for the food, grateful for the hands that made it, grateful for what it means. Setting a boundary wasn't the same as closing a door. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps a door from disappearing entirely. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. If stories like this matter to you, please like this video and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. You are not alone in this. None of us are.